Dear friends, welcome to this special teaching series on the churches of Revelation. And today we're going to look at the church of Smyrna and see how that applies to us as believers today. My name is Enoch Lavender, and I'm a pastor who specializes in the Jewish background of our faith and how that applies to end times and how we live our lives today. So let's dive straight into the topic. Revelation 2, verses 8 to 11. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things say the first and the last who was dead and came to life. I know your works, your tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of the things that you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. So, this is a very short passage talking about the church in Smyrna, and we're going to bring out some key themes in it. But an important aspect to highlight is that these verses are actually used by anti-Semites a lot in attacking Israel and the Jewish people. I call it the anti-Semites' favorite Bible verse, whereas evangelicals might point to John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Anti-Semites point to this verse, saying, look, it says in the Bible, they say they are Jews, they are not, they are a synagogue of Satan. If you were to do a search online for synagogue or Satan, you'll find all kinds of conspiracy theories talking about how Jewish people are in reality worshippers of Satan. They are actually not real Jews at all. Some will say maybe we are the Jews instead, or maybe the Europeans or the British or the Americans or the Africans. There's all kinds of ideas, and they all build on this verse taken out of its context to say, look, the Bible agrees with what we're saying. These Jews are not the real deal. We should be opposed to them because they are worshippers of Satan. But let's look a bit closer at the context before we jump to these kind of conclusions. Because, firstly, the word synagogue. It says a synagogue of Satan. In that day and age, synagogue was not an exclusive Jewish term. Today, a synagogue is a Jewish place of worship, and a church is a Gentile Christian place of worship. But in that day and age, the word synagogue simply meant an assembly. And so in James chapter 2, the Bible uses the word synagogue, but all translators translate it as assembly or congregation instead of as synagogue. So in James 2, it describes a poor person and a rich person entering your congregation. And you treat the rich person in a different way than the poor person, and you shouldn't do this, is what James is saying. But James is saying when they come into your synagogue, when they come into your assembly. And it's the same word used here in the book of Revelation to talk about a synagogue of Satan. Satan in Hebrew means to accuse. It is an accuser. So a different way of translating it, which is better in its original context, is an assembly of accusers, of people who are accusing, a gathering of people who accuse. It's not specifically, exclusively talking about Jewish people, nor is it meant to mean all Jewish people of all time are of this nature. Let's keep on going. It goes on to say, those who say they are Jews and are not. So again, what is this talking about? Well, during the days of the early church, all believers were Jewish, and gradually Gentiles began to join in. Now, many of the Gentiles who joined in were what is known as God-fearers. That means they attended synagogue, they perhaps kept some of the commandments, they listened to the Torah, but they had not converted to Judaism, so they hadn't undergone circumcision. They weren't legally classed as Jews. And many of these were very receptive to the message of Paul and the apostles, and they began to believe in Jesus as the Messiah for Jew and Gentile. But they continued to go to their local synagogue. They continued to learn the books of Moses there, and worshiped God there together with other Jews who believed in Jesus and Jews who did not. Now, during the reign of Emperor Domitian, who reigned towards the end of the first century, so AD 86 to 96 roughly, there was a wave of persecution that broke out. Now, Domitian, he had a distrust and a dislike towards the Jewish people. But as he began to come against them, he discovered a whole new class of people he wasn't aware of. And these were Gentiles. Gentiles who went to synagogue and believed in Jesus. They were right under his nose, so to speak. He wasn't aware that people even around him, even in Rome, even perhaps in the Roman emperor's court, were believers in this Jewish Messiah and going to synagogue. And so he began to institute laws to create a distinction between Jews and Gentiles who came to synagogue. So he placed a tax in place on Jewish people in general, but he also made it a punishable offense for people to be what is called atheists. So if you were a Gentile and a Roman who didn't worship the Roman gods, you were in trouble. And you couldn't just say, well, I go to synagogue. You had to either be legally classed as a Jew or you would be a Roman or a Gentile. And so there'll be different laws for different parts of society. And the result was a pressure on Gentile God-fearers going to the synagogue. And there was already pressure on the Jewish leaders of the synagogue anyway. And so it seems that in this context, that the synagogue leaders were beginning to point out to the Roman authorities who were real Jews and who were not in their congregation. And they're saying, these guys over here, they're actually Gentiles. They actually worship the Christian God, and they actually are people that you are after. And so the wording used here is then to say that, well, Jesus is saying they are Jews and they are attacking you as Gentiles, but their behavior is actually non-Jewish because it is an essential and an important aspect from a Jewish perspective to not betray your brothers. You're not supposed to betray your brothers to a foreign authority, and betraying the believers in Jesus in this way was a very non-Jewish act to do. And so while they were pointing out that these Gentile God-fearers are non-Jews and getting them into trouble, they themselves were behaving like non-Jews in the process. So it's just an important background to understand what was going on in that day. Those who say they are Jews and are not. Now, Jewish and Gentile believers are equal in the sight of God. Paul refers to non-believing Jews as Jews throughout his writings. He doesn't begin to say something like, now Christians, now Gentiles, you have become Jews, the others aren't Jews anymore. For example, in 1 Corinthians 10, he talks about not giving offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church. So he's here giving clear distinctions and recognizing Jews as Jews. He also refers to Gentile believers as being non-Jews. I'm writing to you who are Gentiles, he says in Romans 11:14. So this context is important because there's a lot of confusion in terms of who are the people of God. Have you, as a Christian, become a Jew? And so on. And I believe Paul made a very clear distinction. And it was also a hard distinction to make in his day because it was a lot more politically correct to either remain as a pagan or fully join the Jewish religion. And that's where there was pressure on believers, Gentile believers, to be circumcised because then they could avoid the persecution from the Roman authorities. They could be legally classed as Jews, and it was, in a sense, an easy way out of persecution. And Paul said, no, if you are Gentile, you remain Gentile. If you are Jewish, remain Jewish. So very important distinctions here. Now let's go a bit more into the background of the church of Smyrna itself. So the meaning of Smyrna. So Smyrna, the city, the name means myrrh, the gift, the precious gift that we know from the story of Jesus' birth. And we're going to see links between this amazing spice and a situation for Christians in the city of Myrrh, the city of Smyrna. So Smyrna was a city of great wealth, known for its arts, its magnificent buildings, its education system. It had wide paved streets. It had 6 major temples with a golden street connecting the temples. But in the midst of this, Jesus is addressing the faithful believers and he says, I know your poverty, but you are rich. Because those who had chosen to follow Jesus, as we have already begun to explain, were not popular. There was a wave of persecution coming against them, and the fines, etc., coming from Emperor Domitian was something that impoverished many believers. And so here in a city of great wealth, in a place where people had everything, the believers in Jesus were in poverty. And perhaps some of them had been rich in the past and they had lived an opulent lifestyle, but now they had lost everything because they pursued and they believed in the God of Israel. And they knew who they were and they remained as Gentile God-fearers. And I believe this was precious in God's sight. He says, I know your poverty. I know what you have given up for me. And in my eyes, you are rich. And I believe in some ways you could link these Gentile believers and the Jewish believers in town who suffered so much for their faith to true myrrh, to myrrh that is something so beautiful, something so holy, something so precious, and something that is for royalty. Myrrh was used in holy anointing oil to consecrate priests and holy vessels in a temple. So it relates to consecration. And these believers, they were consecrated. They were wholehearted. They paid the price to follow their Messiah, and they were willing to do so. There was no ifs or buts. And so this letter to the church of Smyrna does not have any condemnation in it. Nothing that Jesus said was wrong with the church. He saw their consecration. He saw their wholeheartedness, and he commended them for standing firm, even in these hard times. Myrrh, as I said, is a royal gift. It was given to Jesus at his birth. Interestingly, it was also given to Joseph when he was a ruler in Egypt and his brothers came to ask for food, to ask for grain, and there was a tribute sent from their father and from the brothers to Joseph, which included myrrh. Myrrh is also used in royal weddings. Psalm 45 describes in beautiful detail a royal wedding of the prince of all princes and the king of all kings. The story of Esther shows how she was bathed for 6 months in myrrh before coming before the king. And I believe that Jesus' bride will be a people consecrated, a people dedicated, a people covered in myrrh, standing firm in persecution, being a sweet fragrance to him in an evil world. Myrrh is bitter. It is bitter to the taste, but it brings a sweet fragrance. The Hebrew name for myrrh is more, and it relates to the word for mar or bitterness. And out of the most bitter circumstances comes a sweet smelling fragrance fit for the king. A story has been told of the journey of a strawberry becoming jam. So just imagine that you are a strawberry for a moment and you are basking in the glorious sunlight. You are growing bigger and bigger by the day. You're feeling really good about yourself. But then one day you're plucked off the strawberry bush and you're thrown in the bottom of a bucket. And other strawberries are placed on top of you. It's dark, it's squishy, it's hot. You're not liking it. After some time in the bucket, finally, the bucket is emptied out onto a kitchen bench and you find yourself on the kitchen bench. And you think, okay, well, the worst is over. Well, no, it's not. Because soon a knife comes out and they begin to chop up all the strawberries. And you're thrown from there, into a pot. And a pot where the heat is turned on. And it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And so this poor strawberry is having a pretty hard journey. Then as the strawberry jam gets mixed together, a spoon gets dipped in and the person making it tastes the jam and finds that no, it's not sweet enough. And they begin to add sugar, and sugar increases the temperature that is inside the pot. So it gets hotter and hotter. And they taste it again, and they taste it again until finally it tastes sweet. You see, we could compare that to our lives, and I believe the Lord allows times of pressure, and the enemy comes against us and he puts pressure on us. But God is looking for a sweetness, a beautiful fragrance, so to speak, to arise from his people. And so he's testing us, seeing, are we in the middle of this responding in a good way? And that is what the church in Smyrna did. They responded in a good way. They let go of their possessions. They let go of everything they had, and they followed Jesus. And there was a sweetness and a beauty to them. And that is a challenge for us too in the pressures of life. That instead of complaining and ourselves becoming bitter, blaming everyone around us, blaming someone else, it's their fault. Instead, that we just commit ourselves to God and we follow him and we lay our lives into his care, then there is a sweetness that comes from us. And that sweetness is something that God is looking for and something that really brings pleasure to him. It is a royal gift of great, great worth. It brings a smile to his face as we are different from the bitterness of this world. Now, myrrh, we see it happen at the scene at the foot of the cross. Because there, in the midst of Jesus' suffering, they offered him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. Now, myrrh was a painkiller. It was an opioid. It was a bit like a drug. But Jesus wanted to remain clear. He was clear, he was present, he was with it throughout the whole journey. And he urged the church of Smyrna in the same way to be faithful to the end. In other words, no compromise to avoid pain, no trying to get out of it, trying to escape it. Jesus carried the price for us on the cross, but we as his followers are to take up our crosses and follow him. For some of us, it maybe is a literal cross. For others, it can be other areas of our lives that we have to surrender to him, and there's a price to pay to follow him. And myrrh is linked to death. It was used in embalming in Egypt and in Israel. We see it in the story of Nicodemus, who took Jesus' body down from the cross and began to embalm him in myrrh. And the word death is used 3 times in the short 4 verses written to Smyrna. In other words, there was a clear link again between death and myrrh and this place that they were in. They were under threat of death, and they had counted the cost, and they were willing to follow Jesus no matter what. So what can we learn from Smyrna? I think there's many things we can learn from the amazing, faithful believers in this place. But one thing that is extremely important is to know persecution is coming. Paul says in 2 Timothy that all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. We also see this when Paul speaks to the Thessalonian believers. Now, Paul only spent 3 weeks in Thessalonica. So he had 3 weeks to present the gospel message, to bring people to faith in Jesus as the Messiah, 3 weeks to train them in the essentials, and then he was kicked out. He had to go. So what did he teach them in this time? What was essential for them to know? Well, 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 tells us that he told them about that they would suffer. They would suffer tribulation, just as happened. And so he saw that as an important part of the message, even for young believers to know persecution is coming. Now, sometimes in some of our end time teaching circles, we've had a strong focus on the rapture, and almost to the point of saying we'll get out of here before anything bad happens. And so that can give us a perhaps false sense of security where we feel like we won't face persecution. But it's a promise that those who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Jesus said, if the world hated me, they will hate you as well. There is a price to carry. There is a price to pay. Are we willing to pay that price? And we need to be aware, not to be shocked when these things happen, not to be shocked when the world comes against us, when we see Christians being thrown out of their workplaces because of their faith in Jesus, when we see the world mocking our faith, when we see an increasing hostility in our world towards the Christian faith, we should not be shocked. We should not be surprised. But we need to be willing and able to pay the price. But how can we? It's hard. I'm not someone who is a hero in any sense of the word. I don't like pain. I, for example, don't like getting needles and injections. And I've fainted. I have fainted when I've had a needle. So how will I stand in the face of the threats of persecution? And how will you stand in the threats of it? Well, there is hope. There is hope. Jesus writes to the church in Smyrna and he describes himself as the first and the last. And the first and the last, or the Alpha and Omega in Greek, or the aleph and the tav in Hebrew. Now, to understand this, we have to put on our Hebrew mindset because in the Hebrew view, if you have the beginning and you have the end, you have everything in between. So, for example, in the temple, the day would begin with the morning sacrifice, would end with the evening sacrifice, and this would cover the whole day. It was as if people sacrificed and prayed all day long, but it was covered with the morning and the evening prayer. Jesus saying he's the beginning and the end means he's saying, I'm not just with you in the beginning. I am there. I'm there at the beginning of your faith. I will be there to receive you at the end of your faith journey. But I'm also with you every single step of the way. I'll be with you every day, every moment, all the time, from the beginning to the end. I am He. And that is the word he spoke to a church facing persecution, saying, I am with you every day, and I will be your strength. I will see you through. I'll give you courage when you feel afraid. I'll give you comfort when you are sad. I am the answer to your need every single day. And that was his message of comfort, of hope to the church of Smyrna and to us too in an increasingly hostile world. Another hope that he gives them is the hope of the resurrection. He ends off the letter to the church of Smyrna saying, He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. And we say, hang on a moment, what's this second death? Well, the Bible tells us that there is coming a day when there'll be a resurrection for everyone, when everyone will come physically out of the tombs. And it says in John 5:28 to 29, that those who have done evil will arise to the resurrection of condemnation. So what's this all about? Well, we as Christians have tended to have a very strong focus on heaven to the exclusion of a focus on the resurrection. In fact, some people almost put the two together that resurrection is going to heaven. But let's try to clarify that a bit. A friend of mine was in the US studying a few years ago, and he had the privilege of living with an Orthodox Jewish student. And the two of them had great discussions about faith, about what it meant to believe in God. But my Christian friend was shocked and amazed to discover that his newfound Jewish friend had little emphasis or focus on heaven and eternity. And this was a feature of Judaism. So what is the belief then? If the focus is not on heaven and eternity, then what? Well, the thing is that for Christians, we have been influenced in part by a Gnostic or a Greek worldview. And that Greek worldview basically says the body is evil. And the goal is for the soul and the spirit to escape the captivity of the body to enter some eternal spiritual realm of paradise and bliss. And so from this comes the concept that heaven is our goal, that's a place where we will be spirit beings exclusively, floating around as spirits. Some would say floating on the cloud, playing harps. But as we study the New Testament, we'll find a very different perspective on life after death. So we have in the book of Acts the story of a believer, Tabitha, who died, and they washed her body and laid her in an upper room. And so it was a custom for Jewish burial teams to come and help. They would immerse themselves first, then they would wash and dress the body and prepare it for burial. We see this in the story of Jesus, how they took his body, they bound it in strips of linen with spices to bury him. Now, why go through all this bother? You see, it was a huge process to do all of that, and those who did would then be labeled unclean in Jewish society and had to go through a cleansing process afterwards. Why do all this if the body has no significance? You see, from their perspective, they're getting the body ready for the day it would rise again. It says in 1 Corinthians 15:29, what will they do who are baptized for the dead if the dead do not rise at all? Why then are they baptized for the dead? What we're talking about here is the tradition of cleaning and preparing a body and then having to go through your own baptism, having to go through your own cleansing ritual in Judaism to be cleansed again after what you've just done. So why go through all this fuss? Well, because you believe that this body that has just died is going to rise again. And so you're preparing it for that day. And this hope of a physical, literal resurrection here on earth was central to the early church and central to the believers. After the death of Judas, the disciples came together and said, we need to appoint one to take his place. And a key criteria was that that person had to have been with them all along, seeing the miracles of Jesus and being a witness of his resurrection. It goes on to describe in the book of Acts how the disciples, they went and they preached in the temple about the resurrection. And the Sadducees, who were a group within Judaism who did not believe in the resurrection, were very upset because they spoke about the resurrection. Paul the Apostle, when he was on trial, and he was on trial before a court of Sadducees and Pharisees, he said, I am a Pharisee. Notice there he said, I am, not I was, I am. Because Pharisees were people who studied the Bible and believed it to be literally true, the whole Bible, including the Psalms and the prophets. So he identified himself with them, and then he said, I am on trial because of the hope of the resurrection. And that caused a stir. It caused a stir, but he was saying that his hope, his central purpose was the resurrection. And so the resurrection was a defining feature for the church. We see it in the story of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And Lazarus had passed away. Jesus comes and they are weeping at the tomb. And Jesus too begins to weep. And then Martha is saying, if you had only come earlier, if you had only come earlier. And then Jesus approaches her and they have a conversation. And Jesus says that you will see him again. And she replies, yes, I know I will see him at the end, at the resurrection of the dead. She didn't say, I'll see him in heaven. That was not her focus. Her focus was, I will see him at the resurrection of the dead. Jesus did not contradict that. He did not say, no, that's not right. You will see him in heaven. That is where you're going, is heaven. No, he said, he agreed with that, but he pointed out that I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, I am the one who will bring that resurrection when the day comes. And I'm going to demonstrate it for you right now. And he gave her and those around a foretaste of the resurrection as he raised Lazarus from the dead. And the Jewish people, they knew that it is the Messiah who's going to bring the resurrection. And so when they saw Lazarus raised from the dead, he was a huge sign to them. And they all began to follow Jesus. And straight away after this, we see Jesus entering Jerusalem, and there's a triumphal procession welcoming him because they had seen and they had heard of the resurrection that happened through his ministry. And they knew this is a sign of the Messiah. Because the Messiah is going to raise the dead. He's going to rule and reign in Jerusalem. He's got a task to do here on earth. And so the resurrection is very important when it comes to hope in times of persecution. You see, the central hope was there for persecuted believers both before Jesus and after him of being raised from the dead. There's a story of a horrific time of persecution about 170 years before Jesus. And during that time, people were taken one by one to the emperor to either worship idols and eat pork or be tortured slowly, horrifically to death. And it was a story of 7 sons of a mother who were all brought before the emperor. And one by one they stood firm. One by one they gave their bodies to be tortured and killed. And they did this and they publicly said, I'm giving my hands, I'm giving my legs, I'm giving my body because I know I'll get it back one day. And so the hope was there that no matter what the enemy tries to steal from us right now, even stealing our physical health, even stealing our physical body, even destroying our physical body, it will be restored in the resurrection. And this was the hope also of the early church. In Lyon, in France, in the second century, there was horrible persecution that broke out, and the Romans tried to snuff out the Christian faith. But they found that no matter how hard they tried, they could not stop the early believers. And after a while, they worked out why. Because the believers knew they would be raised from the dead. So the Romans devised a clever plan. They said, let's take the bodies of some dead Christians and let's burn the bones. Let's scatter the ashes. Let's see then how their God can raise someone up from the ashes. And their purpose then was to snuff out the hope of the believers so that they would give up. They would not hold firm to their faith in times of persecution. But the believers knew that God can even gather the ashes of the ground and breathe new life into it. They knew that He could raise them up from the dead, even no matter what happened to their bodies here on earth. And so the Roman attempt to snuff out the faith in Lyon failed because the believers, they knew and they hoped in the resurrection. And so Jesus, speaking to the church of Smyrna, He spoke about the second death. What he's basically saying is there's coming a time of judgment. There's coming a judgment for those who do not believe in him, those who do not follow his ways. They will be judged. They will be dealt with. That day is coming. But there is also a reward for those who follow Jesus. There is a reward for those who believe in him. And that reward is the resurrection. That reward is life here on earth with him ruling and reigning as king in Jerusalem, and we reigning with him. And this hope sustained the church in dark times. This hope, I believe, is essential for the church in our present world to regain, because as persecution intensifies, you will know that no matter what the enemy tries to take away from you, it will be restored one day by Jesus himself. It's not as if you've lost your one chance at living on earth and then you're gone. It's not as if that life here doesn't matter. No, life here matters. It is important. But you will have renewed life here on earth. Now, if you were to go to Israel and to go to the Mount of Olives, you might be surprised by what you see, because we know that site is a place where Jesus will return. But when you go to the Mount of Olives, you'll see it is covered in grave sites. Why? Because these are Jewish graves dating back hundreds, even thousands of years, of people who believe the resurrection is coming. They believe the Messiah is coming to the Mount of Olives, and they want to be there. They want to rise from the dead there and greet him as he comes. So it was a faith statement to bury the bones of a dead person on the Mount of Olives, but that faith is there as a statement for all to see that there is coming a day when the King will come to Jerusalem. He will rule and reign, and you and I, as we believe in him, will be with him. What a day that will be. If you'd like to know more about the resurrection, I've written 3 whole chapters on it in my new book on the Jubilee, Discover the End Time Mystery. You can find it on Amazon, Vision Bookstore, and other retailers. So that's the Jubilee, Discover the End Time Mystery. 3 whole chapters on the restoration to come when God raises the dead and the hope that brings for you and I on a personal level day to day. So in summary, for the Church of Smyrna, we've spoken about how anti-Semites have been misusing this passage of Scripture to attack the Jewish people. We've spoken about how Smyrna means myrrh and was a place of great wealth, but also a place of persecution, betrayal, and poverty. But out of this bitterness, like myrrh, comes a gift fit for a king. We've looked at some applications, specifically that persecution is coming. But Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the aleph and the tav, the beginning and the end. He is always with us. And he is promising for those who believe in him the reward of the resurrection. And that resurrection is the hope to sustain the church in dark hours. So I hope you've enjoyed today's teaching. And if you'd like more, please visit our website. Come to olivetreeministries.tv Again, this is Enoch Lavender, and I hope to see you join me in the next sessions of our teachings on the book of Revelation and the churches of the book of Revelation. God bless you.